Imagine, if you will, a place where the veil between the living and the dead feels thinner than a whisper on a foggy southern night. That's St. Michael's Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina, a hallowed ground steeped in centuries of history where moss-draped oaks stand like silent sentinels over the final resting places of the city's storied past. These ancient trees, their gnarled branches twisting toward the heavens like arthritic fingers, have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the clamor of revolution, and the quiet decay of forgotten souls. Charleston itself, with its cobblestone streets, grand antebellum mansions, and the salty tang of the Atlantic breeze mingling with the scent of magnolia blossoms, has always been a city of contrasts. Opulent beauty masking deep-seated shadows, refined society built upon the backs of the enslaved. But beneath those venerable oaks, in the heart of this cemetery, lie 9 graves that even the most prominent families of Charleston refuse to utter a word about. A taboo so profound it was as if speaking their names might summon the ghosts of unspeakable sins. These weren't just any graves. They belonged to the elite, wealthy plantation owners, whose fortunes were forged in the fertile low-country soil. Watered by the sweat and blood of countless enslaved lives. Names like Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, Judge Marcus Calverton, Captain William Dandridge, and 6 others. Men who once commanded respect in the drawing rooms of Rainbow Row and the boardrooms of the slave markets along the Cooper River. Each headstone, carved from imported marble and etched with epitaphs praising their devoted service to family and community, marked the resting place of a Titan who had met his end between 1851 and 1855. The circumstances of their deaths were eerily uniform, as if scripted by some malevolent force. It always began with a sudden onset of paralysis, a creeping numbness that started in the extremities and spread like ice through veins, rendering the victim immobile within hours. Physicians of the era, clad in their starched collars and armed with leeches and laudanum, would arrive at the bedside, scratching their beards in puzzlement. They'd declare it a merciful death, a swift release from whatever mysterious ailment had struck. No prolonged suffering, they'd assure the grieving widows and heirs. Just a peaceful slipping away, perhaps a complication of gout, heart weakness, or the miasmas that plagued the humid Carolina summers. Autopsies were rare in those days, especially among the upper crust, where propriety demanded quick burials to avoid the scandal of decay in the sweltering heat. And so these men were interred with pomp and circumstance, elaborate funerals attended by Charleston's finest, complete with horse-drawn hearses, black crepe veils, and eulogies extolling their virtues as pillars of Southern society. But whispers persisted. In the servants' quarters of those grand homes, among the enslaved who polished the silver and tended the gardens, tales circulated of unnatural stillness, of eyes that seemed too alive in faces frozen like statues. The families, however, the Petons, the Fitzpatricks, the Calvertons, clamped down on such talk with iron fists. Inheritance disputes were settled swiftly, estates divided without fanfare, and any inquiring minds from the medical community or the press were met with polite but firm rebuffs. A private matter, they'd say, their drawls laced with the steel of old money. Best not to dwell on the departed. Why the silence? Perhaps because these men weren't just victims of fate, they were links in a chain of human misery, profiting from the auction blocks where families were torn asunder like so much chattel. To discuss their deaths might invite scrutiny into their lives, and in a city where reputation was currency, some secrets were worth burying deeper than 6 feet. Fast forward nearly 7 decades to 1923, a year when Charleston was shaking off the dust of the Great War and embracing the roar of the Jazz Age. Automobiles chugged along Broad Street, flappers danced in speakeasies hidden behind wrought iron gates, and the city decided it was time to modernize even its sacred spaces. St. Michael's Cemetery, with its crumbling paths and overgrown plots, was slated for renovation, a project funded by the very descendants of those antebellum elites, eager to preserve their heritage in polished stone and manicured lawns. Groundskeepers, mostly local black laborers whose ancestors might have toiled on the same plantations these dead men once owned, arrived at dawn with shovels and wheelbarrows. The air was thick with the hum of cicadas and the earthy scent of turned soil as they began exhuming select graves to make way for new walkways and drainage systems. What they uncovered that fateful morning would send shockwaves through the city, rippling outward like a stone dropped into the still waters of Charleston harbor. It started with the first coffin, belonging to Colonel Fitzpatrick, pried open under the dappled shade of those ancient oaks. The workers expected dust and bones, perhaps a few tarnished relics. Instead, they found horror etched in wood and flesh. The interior lid of the coffin was marred by deep, frantic scratch marks, gouges from fingernails that had clawed desperately at the unyielding pine, splintering the surface in a bid for escape. The body inside, remarkably preserved by the cool, clay-rich soil, lay twisted in agony, limbs contorted as if in mid-struggle, fingers curled into hooks, mouth frozen in a silent scream. The men recoiled, crossing themselves, murmuring prayers against evil spirits. Word spread quickly, and soon the other 8 graves were opened, each revealing the same macabre tableau. Scratch marks like frantic hieroglyphs, bodies positioned not in repose, but in futile rebellion against their earthen prisons. These weren't peaceful deaths. These were men who had been buried alive, their final hours spent in suffocating darkness, pounding against lids that would not yield. City officials were summoned in haste, mayors, councilmen, and police chiefs, all from lineages intertwined with the victims. They arrived in their Model T Fords, faces paling as they peered into the opened coffins. Panic set in. This wasn't just a grisly find. It was a scandal that could unearth the ugly underbelly of Charleston's slaveholding past, inflaming racial tensions in a South still reeling from Reconstruction and Jim Crow. Orders came swiftly: seal the site, swear the workers to secrecy under threat of jail or worse, and classify the discovery as sensitive historical material. The coffins were reburied deeper, the scratch marks documented in hushed reports locked away in municipal vaults. But the horror didn't end there. As the renovation continued, one groundskeeper, digging near the cemetery's oldest magnolia tree, a massive specimen with roots like serpents and blossoms that perfumed the air even in death, struck something unnatural. Not a root, but a weathered leather-bound journal, buried shallowly as if meant to be found someday. The journal was small, perhaps 8 by 5 inches, its cover cracked and stained by decades underground. But the pages inside were astonishingly intact, preserved by the dry, sandy soil. The handwriting was meticulous, elegant even, a careful script that spoke of education uncommon for the time, especially among the enslaved. The name inscribed on the first page, Solomon Fairfax. As officials leafed through it in the dim light of a nearby crypt, their blood ran cold. This wasn't a diary of daily musings. It was a chronicle of vengeance, spanning 4 years from 1851 to 1855. Entries detailed a calculated campaign of revenge, born from the screams of a shattered family and culminating in the living entombment of 9 men. Solomon Fairfax, it seemed, had been no ordinary man. A skilled healer, an enslaved assistant to a prominent doctor, he had turned his knowledge of medicine into a weapon of poetic justice. The journal described poisons derived from exotic plants, dosages calibrated to mimic death while preserving consciousness, victims selected for their roles in the slave trade that had destroyed his world. It began with anguish. Today I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it, and evolved into cold resolve, mapping out each step toward retribution. The discovery of this journal would haunt Charleston's elite for generations, a spectral reminder that the sins of the fathers could claw their way back from the grave. Whispers in exclusive clubs and ladies' teas speculated on Fairfax's motives. Was he a madman, or a avenger forged in the fires of injustice? Families pored over old letters and ledgers, wondering if their ancestors' merciful deaths hid darker truths. Some even petitioned for private exhumations, only to be stonewalled by the same officials who had buried the evidence. The magnolia tree, under which the journal had lain like a dormant seed, became a site of quiet pilgrimage for those in the know, black Charlestonians who saw in Fairfax a folk hero, a man who had struck back against the machine of oppression. Yet publicly the story was suppressed, folded into the city's labyrinth of secrets, alongside tales of pirate gold and revolutionary ghosts. And now, dear listener, as we peel back these layers of history, like stripping bark from those ancient oaks to reveal the rot beneath, we invite you to join us in uncovering more. Before we delve deeper into the harrowing tale of Solomon Fairfax, the gentle healer twisted by tragedy into Charleston's most methodical killer, we need you to become part of our community of truth seekers. If these buried stories from America's shadowed past intrigue you, hit that subscribe button right now. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode where we exhume the forgotten horrors and hidden heroes of yesteryear. And while you're at it, drop a comment below. What state are you listening from? We love hearing from our audience across the country, from the misty mountains of Appalachia to the sun-soaked shores of California. Your voices add to the chorus of discovery, reminding us that history isn't just in books. It's alive, waiting to be unearthed. But let's linger a moment longer on that fateful 1923 morning, shall we? Picture the groundskeepers, their calloused hands trembling as they brush dirt from the journal's cover. The sun filtering through the oak leaves cast dancing shadows on the pages, illuminating words that seemed to pulse with unresolved rage. The first entry, dated March 15, 1851, set the tone for the entire macabre manuscript. It spoke of a family torn apart at the Charleston slave market, of a wife left dying on a roadside, of children scattered to brutal fates. Fairfax's prose was poetic yet precise, a blend of sorrow and science that hinted at his dual nature, healer by day, harbinger by night. Officials, reading in stunned silence, realized this wasn't mere fiction. Cross-referencing with death records confirmed the victims' names matched those in the scratched coffins. Panic morphed into a cover-up. Telegrams flew to influential families, urging discretion. For the good of the city, they said, but really for the preservatio of fragile legacies. Charleston in the 1920s was a powder keg. The Great Migration had seen thousands of black residents flee north, carrying tales of southern atrocities. The Harlem Renaissance was blooming, amplifying voices long silenced, to reveal that an enslaved man had orchestrated such sophisticated killings, using botanical toxins to simulate death, ensuring his targets awoke in their graves, could ignite unrest. Imagine the headlines, "Slave's Revenge Rises from the Grave." No, better to bury it all again. The journal was photographed, transcribed in secret, then lost in bureaucratic limbo. But copies circulated underground, passed hand to hand in speakeasies and churches, fueling legends. Some said Fairfax's spirit still wandered the cemetery, his journal a curse on those who profited from slavery's legacy. As we stand on the threshold of this story, consider the oaks themselves, witnesses to it all. Planted in the 1700s, they've seen hurricanes ravage the coast, fires consume the city, and now, this revelation of buried alive horrors. Their roots entwine with coffins, drawing sustenance from the very soil soaked in secrets. St. Michael's, named for the archangel who battles evil, seems ironically fitting, a battlefield where the forces of justice and retribution clash eternally. So, truth-seekers, as we prepare to follow Solomon Fairfax's path from heartbroken father to architect of terror, remember, the past doesn't stay buried, it scratches at the lid, demanding to be heard. Subscribe, notify, comment, join the dig. As the flickering candlelight danced across the yellowed pages of Solomon Fairfax's leather journal, unearthed decades later from its earthen hiding place beneath that ancient magnolia, one line stood out like a scar on otherwise flawless skin, a wound that refused to heal. Dated March 15, 1851, it read simply, "Today I watched my wife and see Hildren burn, and I did nothing to stop it." These words weren't mere ink on paper. They were the ignition point of a fire that would consume 9 lives in retribution, transforming a man of mercy into an instrument of calculated terror. But to understand the depth of that blaze, we must step back into the sweltering heart of antebellum Charleston, where the air hung heavy with the mingled scents of blooming jasmine and the brackish whisper of the sea, a city that glittered like a jewel atop a throne built from human suffering. In the 1850s, Charleston reigned as the undisputed crown jewel of Southern aristocracy, a bastion of refinement where opulent white-columned mansions lined the banks of the Cooper River, their verandas offering shaded reprieve from the relentless Carolina sun. Fortunes here were forged in the fertile deltas of rice and cotton plantations, vast empires that stretched into the misty low country, sustained by the ceaseless toil of enslaved Africans whose ancestors had been dragged across the Atlantic in chains. These dynasties, families like the Petons, the Fitzpatricks, and the Calvertons, believed themselves untouchable, gods among men, their wealth insulating them from the moral reckonings that simmered beneath the surface of their polite society. Balls and soirees filled the nights with the tinkling of crystal and the strains of violins, while by day the bustling port echoed with the cries of merchants and the crack of overseers' whips. Yet, amid this veneer of elegance, shadows lurked, the slave markets on Chalmers Street, where human beings were auctioned like livestock, families shattered for profit, and the ever-present threat of yellow fever epidemics that swept through the humid streets like divine judgment. The city's medical community, though modest in size, wielded immense influence among the wealthy elite. In an era before germ theory, when ailments were attributed to bad air or imbalances of humors, private physicians were lifelines for those who could afford them. Mysterious fevers ravaged households, sudden weaknesses felled the robust, and strange paralytic conditions afflicted the prominent with alarming frequency, symptoms that, in hindsight, might hint at the poisons lurking in the city's underbelly. Doctors experimented with quinine for malaria, calomel for purgatives, and exotic imports from distant lands, all in a desperate bid to stave off the reaper. Into this world stepped Dr. Cornelius Hathaway, a man whose practice on Meeting Street had become a beacon for Charleston's upper echelons since its establishment in 1845. Hathaway, a stern figure with wire-rimmed spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard streaked with grey, was renowned for his innovative treatments, infusions of willow bark for pain, vapor inhalations for respiratory ills, and an uncanny grasp of remedies drawn from the far corners of the empire, opium from the Orient, cinchona from the Andes. His success, however, owed much to an unlikely partner, his enslaved assistant, Solomon Fairfax, whose knowledge bordered on the supernatural. Solomon had been acquired specifically for Hathaway's practice, after tales of his botanical prowess spread through the medical circles of the Low Country. Purchased at a premium from the very auction that would later fuel his vengeance, Solomon brought with him skills honed through generations of healers in his family line, ancestors who had blended African herbal traditions with the harsh necessities of plantation life. Unlike the field slaves who bent their backs in the rice paddies under the scorching sun, enduring the sting of mosquitoes and the bite of the lash, Solomon stood tall, his frame lean but strong, his eyes sharp and intelligent, absorbing every detail of his surroundings like a shawl. AR cataloging rare texts, born into bondage on a distant Carolina plantation, he had been granted the rare gift of education in his youth, tutored alongside his former master's children before laws like South Carolina's 1834 statute strictly forbade teaching slaves to read or write, deeming it a threat to the social order. Yet Solomon's mind was a vault of knowledge. Latin medical terms rolled off his tongue with ease, paralysis toxicum remedium, impressing even Hathaway, who increasingly delegated complex tasks to him. Preparing intricate chemical compounds in the dimly lit back room of the practice, assisting in delicate procedures like bloodletting or suturing, Solomon became indispensable. Wealthy patients, initially wary of an enslaved man's touch, soon grew accustomed to his presence, even requesting him by name for his gentle bedside manner, a soothing voice that calmed fevers, intuitive diagnoses that seemed to peer into the soul of an ailment. But Solomon's existence hadn't always been confined to the sterile walls of Hathaway's office, with its shelves lined with glass vials of tinctures and the faint metallic tang of ether hanging in the air. For 32 years prior, he had dwelled on the Pemberton plantation, 15 miles outside Charleston, amid the sprawling fields of indigo and cotton that hugged the winding Ashley River. There, under the sprawling live oaks draped in Spanish moss like ghostly veils, he had built a life as close to contentment as bondage allowed. He married Celia, a woman of quiet strength and warm laughter, whose hands were skilled in weaving baskets from sweetgrass, a tradition carried from the Gullah communities along the coast. Together, they raised 3 children in a modest slave cabin, 2 boys and a girl, their laughter echoing through the quarters like a fragile melody against the backdrop of oppression. The Petons, T. E. Plantation's owners, Edmund Peton, a gambler with a penchant for high-stakes card games at the Jockey Club, and his wife, who turned a blind eye to the cruelties, permitted this family unit not out of benevolence, but pragmatism. Solomon's healing skills were invaluable during the frequent outbreaks of cholera or swamp fever that could decimate a workforce overnight, turning profitable fields into graveyards. Solomon's expertise was legendary among both enslaved and free. He had saved countless lives with poultices for snake bites, brewed from sassafras root and elderberry, teas for consumption, laced with horehound and wild cherry bark, and salves for burns, drawing on recipes whispered down from his grandmother, an African-born healer who had survived the Middle Passage. He observed visiting white physicians keenly, noting their use of laudanum for pain or mercury for syphilis, blending these with traditional remedies in a syncretic art that bordered on alchemy. Even the Petons trusted him to tend their own kin during illnesses, a rare privilege that underscored his value. In the slave quarters, he was a beacon, mending wounds from the overseer's whip, easing births in the dead of night, his hands steady as he whispered incantations of comfort. Life on Pemberton was no idyll. Days began before dawn with the toll of the bell, bodies aching from labor, the constant specter of sale or separation. But Solomon's family provided a sanctuary, a sliver of humanity in a system designed to erode it. That fragile peace shattered abruptly in March of 1851, when Edmund Peton's mounting gambling debts, accrued in smoky backrooms over games of faro and poker, forced him to liquidate assets. In the antebellum South, assets included human beings, and the sale targeted Solomon's wife and children to be dispersed to distant plantations across the state. This was commonplace, owner's juice. Typified family separations as business necessity, a cold calculus that maximized profits by selling individuals to where labor was needed most. But for those ensnared, it was devastation akin to a hurricane ripping through the low country, uprooting lives without mercy. Solomon, his voice trembling but resolute, pleaded with Peton in the plantation's grand parlor, the air thick with the scent of polished mahogany and cigar smoke. He offered to labor additional years without any semblance of compensation, to hire himself out during harvest seasons to neighboring estates, generating extra income to settle the debts. Peton, his face flushed from brandy and desperation, refused. Creditors pounded at the door, demanding immediate payment, and sentiment had no place in ledgers. The auction was set for March 14th at the Charleston slave market, a notorious hub on Chalmers Street where thousands were bought and sold annually, their fate sealed under the auctioneer's gavel. The morning of March 14th dawned grey and oppressive, humidity clinging like a shroud, storm clouds massing over the Ashley River as if the heavens themselves mourned the impending tragedy. Solomon had spent the previous night in their cramped cabin, the dirt floor cool beneath them, holding Celia and the children close. He memorized the curve of Celia's cheek, the sparkle in Marcus's curious eyes, the 8-year-old eldest inheriting his father's intellect, always questioning the stars visible through the cabin's chinks. Samuel, 6 and gentle, mirrored Solomon's affinity for healing, trailing him through the woods to gather yarrow and plantain. Little Grace, 4 years old, clung to her mother's skirts with wide-eyed intuition, sensing the storm though words failed her. Celia, Solomon's wife of 15 years, held her composure like a fortress, channeling her strength into preparing the children, Whispery. Stories of resilience, packing meager belongings, her hands steady despite the quake in her heart. As the slave traders arrived, their wagons creaking under the weight of chains, Solomon watched helplessly as his family was herded aboard, alongside 6 other shattered households, victims of Piton's fiscal ruin. The children's sobs mingled with parents' hollow vows. "We'll find each other again someday." Lies, all of them, crafted to blunt the unbearable. But the true abyss opened midway to Charleston. A wagon wheel struck a deep rut in the rain-sodden road, the vehicle lurching precariously. In the chaos, Celia tumbled out, her head cracking against a jagged roadside rock. Blood bloomed like a crimson flower, and Solomon, shackled and frantic, strained to reach her. The traders, eyes cold as coins, assessed her as unsellable, a loss to be written off. They ordered the wagon onward, abandoning her bleeding and unconscious in the mud. Solomon's screams rent the air, his struggles against restraints futile as fellow slaves restrained him, whispering warnings of collective punishment. The nightmare crescendoed at the Charleston slave market, a grim arena where bidders inspected teeth and limbs like horseflesh. Solomon, chained to a post, witnessed his children's dispersal, Marcus to a Georgetown rice planter, condemned to child labor in alligator-infested irrigation ditches, Samuel to an up-country cotton farmer, infamous for working slaves to exhaustion, Grace to a Savannah family as a house servant, vanishing into the web of southern bondage. Through it all, Solomon wore a mask of resignation. Any outburst invited the whip, but inwardly a fundamental fracture occurred. The healer, devoted to preserving life, beheld the annihilation of his world by men who commodified humanity. Dr. Hathaway, oblivious to the full horror, bought Solomon for his skills, hearing of his wren. Owned from peers. As Solomon was led away, glancing back at the market's horrors, a glacial resolve took root. A patience to bide time, learn, and exact payment, matching the crime's scale. That evening, in his sparse room above the practice, by candlelight's glow, Solomon penned his journal's genesis. "Today I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it, but I'm still alive, and I remember every face, every name, every voice that laughed as my world ended. They think they have broken me, but they have only taught me patience." This entry marked the healer's fall, the spark of vengeance in a soul forged for salvation. In Charleston's gilded cage, amid the river's murmur and the elite's oblivious revelry, Solomon Fairfax began his metamorphosis. In the shadowed confines of Dr. Hathaway's medical practice on Meeting Street, where the air carried the sharp tang of carbolic acid and the faint, earthy aroma of dried herbs, the months following Solomon Fairfax's arrival blurred into a monotonous rhythm of routine. Each day dawned with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages on the cobblestones outside, heralding the arrival of Charleston's afflicted elite, men and women draped in fine silks and linens, seeking relief from the ailments that wealth could not wholly ward off. Solomon moved through these days with the quiet competence that had defined him as a healer, his hands steady as he mixed compounds in glass vials, the soft clink of pestle against mortar a familiar symphony. He prepared treatment rooms with meticulous care, laying out linens starched to crisp perfection, arranging instruments that gleamed under the gas lamp's warm glow. He assisted in patient care with a deference that masked his inner turmoil, applying poultices to swollen joints or measuring doses of laudanum with unerring precision. To the outside world he was the model assistant, unobtrue. Civ, efficient, a shadow that enhanced the doctor's brilliance without claiming the light. But beneath this facade of acceptance, a darker current surged. Solomon was conducting an entirely different kind of study, one that unfolded in the hidden recesses of his mind and the whispered networks of the enslaved. While his hands busied themselves with salves and syringes, his eyes and ears absorbed the intimate details of Charleston's medical community, the rival physicians who occasionally consulted with Hathaway, the apothecaries supplying rare ingredients from distant ports, the latest treatises arriving in leather-bound volumes from Europe. More crucially, he delved into the lives of the wealthy families who comprised the practice's clientele. These were the aristocrats of the Lowcountry, rice barons with estates sprawling along the Ashley and Cooper rivers, cotton merchants whose warehouses brimmed with bales destined for English mills, bankers whose ledgers concealed the profits of human trafficking. Solomon listened intently during consultations, noting offhand remarks about business ventures or social ties in the evenings after the last patient had departed, and Hathaway retired to his study with a glass of port. Solomon ventured into the city's underbelly, the slave quarters behind the grand mansions, where kitchen hands and stable boys gathered in hushed circles under the cover of night. Through discreet inquiries, traded like currency in this invisible economy of information, he pieced together mosaics of exploitation: who owned which ships laden with chained cargo, who financed the auctions, who turned a blind eye to the cries echoing from the market blocks. Dr. Hathaway himself, a widower in his 50s with no children to inherit his legacy, had come to rely heavily on Solomon's expertise. The doctor's hands, once deft as a surgeon's, now trembled with the onset of arthritis, joints swollen and protesting each precise movement. Solomon's steady grip and encyclopedic knowledge of medicinal preparations, recipes for tonics that soothed inflammation, elixirs that quelled fevers, had become indispensable. Hathaway, his face lined with the weariness of years spent battling the South's endemic diseases, often leaned on his assistant for more than menial tasks. "Solomon, prepare the digitalis extract," he'd command, his voice gruff but laced with unspoken gratitude. More importantly, for the seeds of Solomon's plans taking root, Hathaway began delegating patient interactions. For chronic cases, gout that flared in the humid summers, neuralgias that struck like lightning, Solomon was trusted to monitor progress independently, adjusting dosages and recording symptoms in the practice's leather-bound ledger. This autonomy was a double-edged blade. It granted Solomon access, but demanded he maintain an impeccable veneer of loyalty. Charleston's wealthy elite, accustomed to the pinnacle of medical care, imported leeches from France, morphine distilled in gleaming laboratories, initially regarded Solomon with the casual indifference and condescending approval typical of their class toward skilled slaves. A raised eyebrow here, a patronizing nod there, as if his presence were a novelty in their world of privilege. Yet his competence shone through like sunlight-piercing storm clouds. His respectful demeanor, the way he averted his eyes just enough to convey deference while his touch remained assured and gentle, gradually eroded their reservations. Patients began requesting him specifically, "Send Solomon. His hands work miracles on these aches." They praised his intuitive understanding, how he seemed to sense the root of a malady before they voiced it, a legacy of his ancestral healing arts blended with observed science. This trust was the cornerstone Solomon needed, a bridge into their lives that he would one day use to cross into vengeance. During this period, Solomon's research deepened into obsession. He methodically catalogued the backgrounds of every affluent family crossing the practice's threshold. Business dealings unfolded like maps, partnerships in shipping firms that ferried slaves from Africa, investments in railroads that transported human cargo inland. Social connections wove a web, memberships in the St. Cecilia Society, where balls masked deals struck in alcoves, seats on church boards preaching benevolence while endorsing bondage. Most damningly, he uncovered their entanglements in the slave trade that had ravaged his own family. Through eavesdropped conversations and relayed gossip from house slaves, who cleaned the parlors where ledgers lay open, who served the brandy-fueled discussions, Solomon compiled dossiers. Edmund Peton, his former master, emerged as merely one link in a vast chain of exploitation. The Charleston slave market, that grim emporium on Chalmers Street with its holding pens and auction platforms, thrived with the complicity of the city's most respected citizens. These men, deacons in Episcopal churches, patrons of orphanages, treated humans as livestock, buying and selling with ledger precision. They attended elegant dinner parties in chandelier-lit salons, debating Plato and Shakespeare over roast quail, while their fortunes rested on the fractured spines of families like Solomon's. Among Hathaway's regular patients, Solomon pinpointed 9 men with direct ties to his family's destruction. Some had attended the March 14, 1851 auction, bidding on lots with the detached interest of horse traders at a fair, inspecting teeth, prodding muscles, haggling over prices. Others had bankrolled the operations, lending capital to dealers who specialized in family separations to inflate profits, scattering kin to maximize labor distribution. A few had even purchased slaves from that very sale, including those who bought his children, perpetuating a system that deemed people disposable commodities. Their names burned in Solomon's mind: Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, Judge Marcus Calverton, Captain William Dandridge, and 6 others, pillars of society whose hands dripped with invisible blood. As 1851 bled into 1852, Solomon embarked on what he privately termed his education in advanced chemistry. Hathaway's medical library, a sanctuary of oak shelves groaning under tomes bound in calfskin, became his clandestine academy. Texts on pharmaceutical compounds detailed substances that induced paralysis, unconsciousness, or the semblance of death while preserving awareness, intended for anesthesia or rare treatments, but ripe for darker repurposing. These volumes, illuminated by the soft hiss of gas lamps, transformed into textbooks for a curriculum of revenge. The pivotal discovery lay in a treatise on South American plant toxins, describing a compound from a vine native to the Amazon basin. This insidious plant, with tendrils like serpents and leaves veined in emerald, had been cultivated in the greenhouse of a Charleston botanist supplying exotics to collectors. Properly extracted, the toxin triggered complete muscular paralysis, yet left consciousness and sensation intact. Victims appeared deceased to untrained eyes, no breath detectable, pulse faint as a whisper, but remained fully aware, trapped in a living tomb, for hours before fatality ensued. Solomon devoted months to mastery, identifying the vine through botanical sketches, cultivating cuttings in hidden pots. He located specimens in the greenhouse of Professor Nathaniel Crenshaw, Hathaway's friend and natural sciences lecturer at the College of Charleston. Crenshaw, a bespectacled enthusiast, with soil-stained fingers, mistook Solomon's interest for shared passion and permitted him to tend the collection, pruning, watering, under the glass dome where humidity mimicked the tropics. Experimentation followed, careful tests on laboratory mice in a secluded shed, observing twitches fade to stillness, calibrating dosages. Too little yielded weakness, too much, instant demise. The ideal amount mimicked death flawlessly, preserving awareness for the burial's terror. Psychological fortification demanded equal rigor. Solomon sustained his gentle facade, smiling at patients, nodding to Hathaway, while steeling for atrocities antithetical to his healing ethos. He rationalized via journal rituals, reciting Marcus, Samuel, and Grace's names, evoking their fates against the profiteers' indifference. As winter's chill gripped Charleston in 1852, frosting window panes and hushing the river's flow, Solomon selected his inaugural target, Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick. A rice planter of vast holdings, Fitzpatrick had attended the auction jesting crudely about the children's breeding potential amid laughter. His chronic gout necessitated monthly visits, trusting Solomon implicitly, arriving unaccompanied, ideal for isolation. Yet Solomon waited, patience his ally, ensuring flawless execution to evade suspicion. His journal brimmed with profiles, medical histories, schedules, slave trade sins. Physicians' notes twisted into execution plans, not healing but inflicting the terror his children endured. Solomon's metamorphosis from healer to killer crystallized in 1852's meticulous preparations. Every facet perfected, contingencies mapped, variables tamed. Targets were societal titans. Their deaths would invite scrutiny from elite physicians and pressured authorities. First, Solomon ingrained himself as vital, arriving pre-dawn to ready the office, lingering post-sunset organizing supple. Ease. Earning Hathaway's reliance on his acumen, compound refinement spanned months in a rear shed, ostensibly for herbals. Cultivating the vine, extracting essence, perilous, with accidental exposures inducing numbness, foreshadowing victims' doom. The final elixir, colorless, odorless, miscible undetected. Administered precisely, effects cascaded, weakness in 30 minutes, mimicking ailments, full paralysis in an hour, senses alert, breathing and pulse undetectable, sans scrutiny. 1850s medicine, sans stethoscopes or monitors, deemed it natural death. Fitzpatrick's choice was tactical, predictable visits, arrogance fueling contempt, solitary life saved terrified slaves unlikely to demand wakes. His weak heart provided cover. Sudden demise, obvious cardiac failure, no autopsy. December 15, 1852, Fitzpatrick arrived, gout aggrieved, Hathaway occupied, delegated to Solomon. Preparing medication, Solomon added toxin drops, hands unflinching. Fitzpatrick ingested unquestioningly. As weakness gripped, Solomon confided softly, "Colonel, I am Solomon Fairfax. You ruined my family March 14, 1851, laughing at my children's sale, joking their worth as stock." Recall. Recognition flickered to horror. Speech failed. Solomon elucidated, not dead yet, paralyzed but aware. "Hathaway will declare heart failure. Buried tomorrow in St. Michael's, alive hours more. Dirt thudding, contemplating your sins." True terror. Paralysis complete, corpse-like, eyes pleading. Solomon verified vitals faintness. Hathaway entered, found Solomon somber. The colonel passed peacefully. "Doctor, heart failure." Examination concurred, body removed, funeral arranged. Solomon attended, slave sectioned. As coffin descended, shovelfuls echoed. Was Fitzpatrick aware? No joy, just justice's chill. Evening journal, Fitzpatrick paid. 8 remain. Justice patient certain. In the wake of Colonel Reginald Fitzpa. Trick's burial, beneath the somber canopy of St. Michael's Cemetery, where the ancient oaks whispered secrets to the wind. The months dragged on with an agonizing slowness that tested even Solomon Fairfax's ironclad patience. Charleston, ever the bustling port city, carried on with its rhythms, ships creaking into harbor laden with cotton and indigo, the clang of blacksmith hammers echoing through the streets, and the elite sipping sweet tea on shaded verandas, oblivious to the shadow creeping through their midst. Solomon waited, his senses attuned to every murmur in the medical practice, every snippet of gossip carried on the humid breeze. Would his method, the paralytic toxin that mimicked death so convincingly, arouse suspicion? He observed Dr. Hathaway closely, noting how the doctor referenced Fitzpatrick's case in conversations with colleagues, framing it as a cautionary tale of how heart failure could strike swiftly, even in the seemingly robust. "A reminder of our fragile mortality," Hathaway would say, shaking his head over a shared pipe in the evening. Charleston's social circles buzzed with the expected formalities, black-bordered condolence letters exchanged among the mansions along the Battery, remembrances of the colonel's contributions to the rice trade, and his generous, if self-serving, donations to the orphanage. But no probing questions emerged, no whispers of foul play. The death was chalked up to natural causes, a merciful end for a man plagued by gout. Solomon's reputation remained pristine, a skilled, caring assistant whose gentle demeanor endeared him to patients and master alike. This unblemished success infused Solomon with a quiet confidence, a spark that propelled him toward the second phase of his meticulously plotted revenge. Yet, it came at a cost he hadn't fully anticipated. Despite the years of simmering rage, the careful blueprints etched his hidden journal, and the absolute conviction that his cause was just, a reckoning for the men who had shattered his family. The act of orchestrating Fitzpatrick's terror had burrowed deep into his psyche. He found himself tossing in his narrow cot above the practice, the creak of floorboards mirroring the unrest in his soul. Not guilt, no. Solomon harbored no remorse for a man who had laughed at the auction block, treating children like breeding stock. It was the vivid imagination of those final hours, the muffled thuds of earth on the coffin lid, the suffocating darkness, the frantic, futile scratches against unyielding wood. What must it feel like, he wondered in the witching hours, to awaken in that eternal night, lungs burning for air that would never come? These visions haunted him, not as regrets, but as echoes of his own powerlessness on that fateful March day in 1851. Sleep evaded him for weeks, his days a mechanical performance of duties while his mind replayed the scene like a macabre theater. Selecting his second victim demanded the same deliberate calculus that had defined his plan. Solomon knew patterns were his enemy. Repetition could draw eyes where shadows were needed. He varied intervals and causes meticulously, heart failure for one, perhaps stroke for another, to cloak his handiwork in the veil of coincidence. His clandestine research, pieced from overheard consultations and slave quarter intelligence, spotlighted Judge Marcus Calverton as the ideal next target. A towering figure in Charleston's legal circles, Calverton was a man whose robes hid a heart as cold as the marble in his courtroom. He hadn't just witnessed the sale of Solomon's family, he had sanctified it, arguing in precedent-setting cases that separating slave families was essential for maintaining social order and maximizing economic efficiency. His words, delivered with the gravita of a patriarch, had legitimized the auctioneer's gavel, turning human tragedy into legal doctrine. Now, in his twilight years, the judge battled severe migraines that had intensified over the past 2 years, throbbing assaults that left him bedridden, eyes shielded from the piercing Carolina sun. These ailments drove him to Hathaway's practice with increasing frequency, seeking relief in opiates and compresses. For Solomon, it was providence. Migraine sufferers often succumbed to fatal strokes, and Calverton's age rendered such an end plausible, a natural curtain to his engineered demise. But fate, ever capricious, threw a wrench into Solomon's gears before he could strike. In March of 1853, as the first blooms of spring painted the city's gardens in vibrant hues, Dr. Hathaway announced a development that sent ripples through the practice. Seated in his cluttered study, amid stacks of medical journals and the faint scent of pipe tobacco, he revealed his intention to take on a junior partner, Dr. Timothy Henderson. A fresh-faced physician recently graduated from Philadelphia's esteemed medical schools. Henderson, eager to carve his niche in Charleston's competitive arena, brought youthful vigor and cutting-edge knowledge. For Solomon, this was catastrophe. A new set of eyes would mean heightened scrutiny, every compound mixed, every patient interaction observed. Administering the paralytic would become a high-wire act fraught with witnesses. Worse, Henderson's training included the nascent field of forensic medicine, techniques for dissecting cadavers, detecting anomalous substances in tissues, unraveling the riddles of suspicious deaths. Solomon's exotic toxin, derived from that Amazonian vine, might evade Hathaway's error-bound expertise, but a modern trained mind could pierce the veil. Realization dawned like a storm over the harbor. Acceleration was imperative, his or original timeline, a leisurely spacing over years to mimic random fate, compressed into months. Henderson's arrival loomed like an executioner's axe. Solomon must complete his mission before the practice transformed into a fortress of observation. This haste bred risk, imperfect conditions, hurried preparations, but desperation sharpened his resolve. The pressure culminated in his first grave error during Judge Calverton's April 1853 treatment. In the dim treatment room, amid the clink of glassware and the judge's groans of pain, Solomon's hand slipped, dosing slightly higher than calibrated. The paralysis seized rapidly, a vise too tight. Calverton's body stiffened like a statue, eyes wide with trapped horror. Hathaway, summoned, murmured in puzzlement, "Strange. The rigidity exceeds typical stroke victims." And those eyes, almost desperate. Solomon's heart thundered as the doctor probed deeper, fingers pressing for pulses, stethoscope, a recent innovation. To the chest. Terror gripped him. Exposure seemed inevitable. Yet, Hathaway's knowledge, rooted in leeches and humors, fell short. After 15 agonizing minutes, he attributed anomalies to a particularly severe stroke. Poor soul must have suffered terribly, he sighed, unwittingly narrating Calverton's conscious torment as undertakers prepared the corpse. The funeral eclipsed Fitzpatrick's in grandeur, befitting a 30-year legal luminary. Charleston's luminaries gathered under leaden skies, black veils fluttering like ravens. From the slave section, Solomon watched the coffin descend, 3 rows from Fitzpatrick's plot. A chill pierced him, a young man at the crowd's edge, scribbling in a leather notebook. Thomas Grimby, journalist for the Charleston Mercury, probed what he dubbed the prominent deaths phenomenon, sudden fatalities among the elite, explainable individually but suspicious collectively over Sigh. Solomon's journal that night betrayed unease. Calverton joins Fitzpatrick in justice, but patterns emerge, threatening my mission. I must hasten, risks be damned. Acceleration demanded his third victim swiftly, Captain William Dandridge, a seafaring slaver whose vessels plied southern markets, loading humans with the precision of cotton bales. Healthy, save occasional maritime mishaps, Dandridge rarely visited the practice. Solomon must engineer opportunity. His slave network, a web of kitchen whispers along the battery, yielded gold, a May 20th, 1853 dinner party at Dandridge's East Bay mansion for shipping magnates. Solomon infiltrated via Martha, an elderly kitchen overseer. Her regulars felled by fever. Grateful, she enlisted him. Just as we thought we'd plumbed Charleston's horrors, intensity mounts. If chills grip you, share with dark mystery lovers. Like to bolster us? Subscribe for more. Discover onward together. May 20th's Eve heralded Solomon's unraveling. The mansion gleamed, crystal chandeliers, silver-laden tables. 12 merchants convened, plotting slave route expansions. Solomon, invisible servant, refilled goblets, eavesdropped on brutality. Dandridge, robust and graying, regaling with rebellion-quelling tactics, cargo survival methods, contemptible. Overheard talks unveiled complicity networks, marking future targets, humans as commodities, family rifts mere overhead, opportunity struck with dessert, individual brandy-soaked cakes. In the kitchen steam, Solomon laced Dandridge's with toxin, absorbed seamlessly. The captain savored it, praising Martha. Dizziness hit in 30 minutes, blamed on wine and heat. He retreated to his study, collapsing as paralysis peaked. Discovery erupted, 12 witnesses demanding answers. Guest Dr. Samuel Pettigrew examined, peculiar, seizure sans apoplexy signs. Rigidity suggests poison, the word electri. Fide, physicians summoned, news spreading by dawn. Grimby arrived pre-light, interviewing, uncovering Solomon's presence, linking him to multiple deaths. The net constricted, mission incomplete, 6 targets alive, scrutiny mounting. Desperation birthed audacity, simultaneous strikes. Research revealed June 15th's clandestine meeting at Henderson and Associates. 6 traders finalizing expansions. Evening post-hours, plan, ingenious terror. Nights crafting concentrated toxin, injecting into gas lines, lamps lit, aerosol death. June 15th, alley vigil, windows glowed at 8, trap sprung. Silence fell, Solomon entered via duplicate key. Conference room horror, 6 frozen around mahogany, eyes tracking in terror. Solomon addressed each clinically identity, fate, conscious burials, suffocations, agony. Satisfaction surged, unanticipated. Triumph fleeting, footsteps. Grimby entered, leads converging. It's true, you're murdering the elite. Plans unraveled. Solomon confessed motive. They destroyed my family. Justice, not murder. Grimby's conflict, journalists' duty versus Southern empathy for slavery's brutality. They're alive, eyes moving, apparent death, conscious. Solomon affirmed, mirroring his children's terror. Grimby's journal later captured the impasse. Obligation versus understanding. Can't continue but comprehend drive. Systems profiteers deserve reckoning. Solomon's philosophy, just society prevents destruction. Denied, I forged my own. Standoff shattered by approaching voices. Grimby offered escape, backstairs, delay report. Solomon refused, mission partial, 3 spared, system endures. Let them come, story spreads, slaves' limits known. Voices swelled. Grimby chose story, documenting. Constables burst, baffling scene. 6 dead, Solomon confessing methods, compound, selections. Archives preserved his precision, solving years' mysteries. In the sweltering heat of a Charleston summer, where the air hung thick with the scent of blooming magnolias and the distant rumble of thunder over the harbor, the trial of Solomon Fairfax unfolded like a storm that had been brewing for decades. It became one of the most controversial legal proceedings in the city's antebellum history, not because there was any shadow of doubt about his guilt. Solomon had confessed openly, his words as precise and unyielding as the chemical compounds he had wielded, but because it cracked open a Pandora's box of moral quandaries about slavery, justice, and the breaking point of human endurance. The courtroom, a grand chamber in the heart of the city with its high ceilings and polished mahogany benches, was packed to the rafters. Spectators from all walks of Southern society crammed in, wealthy planters in tailored coats, their wives fanning themselves with lace handkerchiefs, journalists scribbling furiously, and even a smattering of free black residents, their presence a rare and tense anomaly in such a space. Outside, crowds gathered under the palmetto trees, whispering about the slave who had turned the tables on his oppressors, his story spreading like wildfire through the cobblestone streets and into the shadowed alleys of the slave quarters. The prosecution, spearheaded by District Attorney Charles Rutledge, a sharp-eyed man with a reputation for ironclad cases and a lineage tied to Charleston's founding families, framed the affair as a straightforward saga of murder. "This is not a tale of tragedy or retribution," Rutledge thundered in his opening statement, his voice echoing off the walls like a judge's gavel. "It is the cold-blooded killing of 9 prominent citizens by a slave who forgot his place. Solomon Fairfax must hang, not merely for his crimes, but to preserve the social order upon which our great society stands." Rutledge painted Solomon as a monster, a deviant who had abused his position of trust to sow terror among the elite. Witnesses were paraded, constables describing the eerie scene at Henderson and Associates, where 6 men sat frozen like wax figures around a conference table, medical experts speculating on the toxin's mechanics, their testimonies laced with awe and revulsion. The goal was clear: swift conviction, public execution, a lesson to any enslaved person daring to dream of uprising. On the other side, the court-appointed defense, led by the reluctant attorney Benjamin Crawford, a bookish lawyer more accustomed to property disputes than capital cases, faced a Herculean task. Crawford, with his wire-rimmed spectacles and a voice that trembled slightly under the weight of the courtroom's gaze, had little hope of acquittal. Solomon's confession was ironclad, detailed down to the dosages and derivations of his paralytic brew. Instead, Crawford pivoted to a bolder strategy, not denial of guilt, but illumination of the horrors that birthed it. "Gentlemen of the jury," he implored, "consider the forge that tempered this man's blade, the systematic destruction of his family under the auspices of our laws, laws that deem human beings as chattel to be bought, sold, and scattered. If Solomon Fairfax is a murderer, then what are we? Who created the desperation that drove him?" Crawford's arguments peeled back the genteel facade of Southern slavery, exposing its raw underbelly. Testimonies painted vivid pictures: the methods of family separation at auctions, where children were pried from mothers' arms amid wails that echoed like banshees; the casual cruelty of traders who haggled over lives as if bartering for cotton bales; the utter powerlessness of the enslaved, stripped of legal recourse, their pleas falling on deaf ears. This mirror held up to society was uncomfortable, forcing the elite to confer on how their economic empire rested on fractured families and stolen futures. Whispers rippled through the gallery, some of outrage, others of uneasy reflection, as Crawford argued that Solomon's acts, while criminal, were the inevitable fruit of an unjust tree. At the center of it all stood Solomon himself, a figure of stoic composure amid the chaos. Dressed in simple linens, chains clanking softly with each movement, he delivered his testimony with the calm articulation of a scholar, not a condemned man. He recounted watching his family destroyed, the wagon accident that left his wife Celia bleeding by the roadside, the auction where his children, Marcus, Samuel, and Grace, were sold to distant horrors, without a tremor in his voice. "I could not intervene," he said, his eyes meeting those of the jurors, "for I was property, as they were." But in that helplessness, a resolve was born. His words forced Charleston's aristocracy to grapple with the human toll of their system, the rice fields worked by broken souls, the grand mansions built on tiers. Thomas Grimby, the tenacious journalist for the Charleston Mercury whose notebook had first captured the suspicious deaths, amplified this drama through his coverage. His articles splashed across front pages with headlines like "The Healer's Deadly Hand," "Slave's Revenge Shakes the South," included extensive excerpts from Solomon's journal, those meticulous entries blending sorrow, science, and seething justice. Grimby's prose, vivid and unflinching, detailed the paralytic compound's ingenuity, turning Solomon-esque story into a sensation reprinted from Virginia's tobacco plantations to Louisiana's sugar fields. For slave owners across the region, it was a source of fascination laced with terror, a bedtime story turned nightmare, whispering that even the most trusted bondsman might harbor a vendetta. The medical dimensions of Solomon. Crimes captivated the scientific community, drawing physicians from as far as New Orleans to observe the proceedings. Dr. Hathaway, Solomon's former employer, took the stand in a state of visible devastation, his once steady hands now shaking as he testified. "I trusted him implicitly," Hathaway admitted, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "His knowledge of pharmaceuticals was unparalleled. He had access to my library, my supplies, even my greenhouse contacts." The revelation that an enslaved man could master complex chemistry and toxicology upended deeply held prejudices about intellectual capacity. Debates erupted in medical societies. Was educating slaves a folly, arming them with tools that could turn against their masters? Solomon's compound, derived from that exotic Amazonian vine, became a case study, prompting whispers of forbidden knowledge and calls for stricter controls on scientific education among the bonded. Perhaps the most harrowing testimonies came from the 6 survivors of the Henderson and Associates massacre, men who had been paralyzed but rescued before burial, their ordeals varying in duration and dread. They shuffled to the stand, faces etched with the pallor of those who had stared into the abyss. Colonel Harrison Vance, a burly trader with a voice now reduced to a rasp, described the psychological torment in gut-wrenching detail. "I could hear everything, feel everything, but I could not move so much as an eyelid," he recounted, his words hanging heavy in the courtroom air. "When my wife wept over what she thought was my corpse, her tears falling on my face, I yearned to comfort her, to whisper that I lived, but I was entombed in my own flesh, helpless as funeral plans were made around me. If Fairfax sought to teach terror, he succeeded beyond mortal measure." The gallery gasped. Some women fainted into their escorts' arms. These accounts transcended legal jargon, offering a visceral glimpse into Solomon's revenge, the same suffocating fear his children had endured on that wagon to the market. The bombshell revelation that 3 earlier victims, Fitzpatrick, Calverton, and Dandridge, had been buried alive ignited a firestorm far beyond Charleston's wrought iron gates. Scratch marks in coffins, unearthed in later exhumations, fueled public outcry. Families across the South, from Savannah's squares to Mobile's bayous, questioned their loved ones' natural deaths. Demands for disinterments surged, overwhelming morticians and doctors, breeding a paranoia that lingered like fog over the Mississippi. Was grandfather truly gone when we laid him to rest? Became a whispered dread at family gatherings. Throughout, Solomon remained unflinching, expressing regret only for his incomplete mission. 3 targets escaped his grasp. His final court statement chilled the room. "I was trained to preserve life and ease suffering, but when this society raised my family, deeming it legal, I learned healing's duality. I seek no mercy, for none was granted my kin. Remember, as you condemn me, I didn't forge this vengeful system." The jury deliberated under an hour, guilty on all counts, death by hanging. The verdict, unsurprising in a slave society clinging to order, failed to quell the ethical storm. Was slavery's stability an illusion, built on suppressed rage? On October 15, 1853, before over 2,000 spectators, a sea of faces under a leaden sky, Solomon ascended the gallows with unbroken poise. Grimby recorded his last words, "I die knowing 9 felt my children's terror. It renders death worthwhile. But this system endures, birthing more despair. Remember, even the patient have limits, buried unmarked beyond city limits, per laws barring criminals from hallowed ground. Solomon's body vanished, but his journal endured. Confiscated, it was copied by Grimby before return. In 1889, penning memoirs, Grimby interred it under St. Michael's magnolia near his victims' graves. "I couldn't destroy such a record," he wrote, "nor inspire imitators. Future generations may grasp its necessity." 1923's renovation unearthed it, alongside scratched coffins, proof incarnate. Officials sealed records, citing public safety, but whispers persisted, shielding ancestral sins. Solomon's legacy rippled outward. Antebellum South grew wary of educated slaves, enacting laws curbing books, training, fearing knowledge as weapon. Forensics advanced, toxin detection refined post-mortem techniques. Most profoundly, it fueled slavery debates. If a loyal, skilled bondsman could orchestrate such, what seethed in millions? Individual resistance quaked empires. This mystery illuminates history's dark. Justice delayed morphs terribly. Solomon's tale queries, justified vengeance or echoed evil? Comment below your thoughts on this Charleston chill. Enjoyed? Subscribe, bell, share for truths unearthed. Until next, past awaits the digger.